The background to Beowulf. From a time and place so strange that we can barely imagine it, and about an era even more remote and incomprehensible, Beowulf stands at the head of English literature with more difficulties, questions, and dilemmas than certainties. And many scholars accept the fact that they will never get closer than conjecture to the keys to Beowulf. For starters, the first great English epic poem is written in a language that only specialists recognize as English. Old English looks strange to the modern eye and sounds more like German, its very close ancestor. What? Weyardena in ye dagum, theod keninga, thrum ye frunen, hutha athelingus ellen fromaden. Which is to say, approximately, listen, of the glory of the Speardane's tribal kings we have heard how their princes displayed their courage. To emphasize its origins, Old English is often referred to as Anglo-Saxon, after two of the tribes which brought the language from Europe to England in the 5th and 6th centuries. When the Roman Empire abandoned Britain in 411 AD, the Celtic Britons were forced to defend themselves for the first time in nearly 400 years. In 449, Vortigern, king of the Britons, asked Hengist and Horsa, brother leaders of the Jutes, to help him repel the Picts and Scots of Scotland and Ireland. The Jutes were so successful, and they saw that the Britons were so weak and disorganized, that they just moved across the English Channel and took up permanent residence in southeast England. The Jutes were followed by the Angles, who settled the northern and eastern parts of the island, and then by the Saxons, who established kingdoms in the southern and western parts of Great Britain. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes spoke mutually understandable dialects of a West Germanic language, the ancestors of the language we speak today. It was during these Germanic invasions that native Britons rallied around their war chiefs and finally stopped the foreigners at the borders of Wales and Scotland. Both of these areas preserve the legend of the greatest defender of Celtic Britain around the figure of King Arthur. But he had to wait more than 1,000 years until the Normans defeated the Anglo-Saxons before he became an English national hero. The antiquity of Beowulf is evident in that it is about the exploits of a hero from the days when the Germanic tribes still lived along the shores of the North Sea. And the audience is expected to be familiar with references to other Germanic tribes and their heroes. The only item in the poem that has been dated is the mention of the death of Hygelac, king of Beowulf's Geats, during a documented raid on the Franks in about 521. Allowing for the brief reign of Hygelac's son, Beowulf's 50-year reign as Geatish king would have coincided with the early days of the Germanic invasion. The only copy of the poem is dated to the 10th century and is preserved in a manuscript identified as coming from the West Saxon kingdom. But exactly when and where the poem was composed during the years 600 to 1000 is undetermined, with experts offering sound reasons for a variety of possibilities. Though we refer to this era as the Dark Ages, the Angles in the kingdoms of Northumberland and Mercia each had peaks of high culture. At the height of Mercia's power, Offa ruled from 757 to 796, dominated island politics, and corresponded with Charlemagne as an equal. The episode in the poem that mentions an earlier continental Offa who has little connection to the action is seen by some as a poetic reference to the poet's patron. Burial goods found in East Anglia are so similar to items described in Beowulf that the East Anglian kingdom has recently been advanced as the original source of the poem. There is even scholarly speculation that remnants of Beowulf's Yeats, who disappeared from history during the 6th century, may have joined Anglian kinsmen in England. The fall of the Yeats, who have lost Beowulf as their king and protector, is predicted by Wiglaf at the end of the poem. Of course, the poet, composing at a later time, is able to make accurate prophecies about events that will follow the time frame of the poem itself. Furthermore, some scholars see a connection between Weohstan, his son Wiglaf, and their tribe, the Wulfingas, and the first Anglian kings of England, Weku and his son Wuffa of the Wulfingas tribe. While most experts agree that the poem originated in eastern England, the one surviving copy comes from the West Country kingdom of the Saxons. Raids of the Vikings, who later colonized northeastern England, destroyed the Anglian kingdoms and many of the writings from those advanced cultures. The West Saxons prevented the complete subjugation of the island, and their warrior king, Alfred the Great, was as dedicated in preserving Anglo-Saxon civilization as he was to holding on to his kingdom. The favorable treatment of the Danes in Beowulf is seen by many as an indication that the poem was written before the 800s, when the Danish invasion intensified. And other critics counter that these references could have been a way to flatter the new Danish rulers while reminding both Danes and Angles that the Germanic tribes had a common origin and a long history of alliances. Wherever Beowulf was first put in writing, the poem reflects only the version of the last of a long line of oral poets who had kept the poem alive while making their own contributions for several centuries. Some scholars see the work of as many as 6 separate poets woven into the whole we have today. And the poem itself says that the story of the fight with Grendel was first recited by Hrothgar's shop. The Old English word for poet, shop, is often translated maker, but shaper is an alternate translation and one which better addresses the function of an oral poet, who shapes both the stock material of tribal legend and the work of his predecessors. Originality was not a goal. That poets fit their work into a familiar poetic tapestry is evident by the many references in Beowulf to other stories, legends, and myths. The first word in the poem is listen. We can well imagine the court shop calling for everyone's attention as he begins his recitation. The oral and thereby dramatic nature of the poem poses problems for interpreters of the written work. Some critics see ironies where others see only seriousness. Without the gestures or facial expressions which would have been conveyed from poet to poet along with the words, some questions will never be resolved. The opening of Beowulf is significant in another sense. The poet begins with a history of the Danes, and not with an invocation to either pagan or Christian sources of inspiration, as is the usual case with epic poetry. Kinship and allegiances are the dominant themes in the parts of Beowulf that do not deal directly with the hero's battles. Who you were in the Germanic tribes depended largely on who your father was and to whom you owed allegiance. Beowulf identifies his troop to the Danes as members of Higelac Hall. And as a faithful follower, Beowulf presents Higelac with most of the rewards that Hrothgar has given him for his service. Higelac, as the ring-giver for the Yeats, then bestows a historic sword and lands upon his kinsman and vassal. Thus, tracing the lineage of Hrothgar, beginning with the mythical Skjold serves as an invocation by establishing the legitimacy of what is about to be recited. And what the audiences heard and saw is something that can be appreciated only by the few people in the world who understand Old English. The storyline in Beowulf is simple. Beowulf fights and kills Grendel. Beowulf fights and kills Grendel's mother. More than 50 years later, Beowulf fights a dragon, which mortally wounds him as he kills it. In our age, where the belief in monsters and dragons is not common, the fantastic nature of the stories makes the poem even harder to grasp. What is the point to it? One of the main points is the poetry, which time and the changes in the English language have made inaccessible. Old English poetry was built on driving rhythms, which have been likened to the rhythm of rowers in the long boats which the Germanic tribes used in their raids, from the days of Beowulf through the days of the Vikings. There are generally 4 strong beats or accents per line, and the lines are of varying syllabic length. Thus, from the west came a wind that wasted the land. The poetic line breaks by its rhythm into 2 halves, called hemstitches, and the manuscripts sometimes show them as 2 separate lines. The modern transcription consists of putting space between the 2 hemstitches to emphasize the pause, or caesura, between them. The rhythm is enhanced by the most famous trademark of Old English verse, alliteration, the repetition of consonant sounds within a line of poetry. In this example, the alliterative elements are capitalized. From the west came a wind that wasted the land, and we fought for our farms as if fiends were attacking. The rain was like rocks as it rattled our roofs, deadly crops, and many mourned our meager harvest. The rhythm is as infectious for the poet as for the listener, and it is easy to imagine a hall full of people swaying in hypnotic unison as the shop recited. The lost grandeur of the poetry is the main casualty of the many years between the first appearance of Beowulf and our own age. The intervening years have seen Old English influenced by Danish, Norman French, and the Latin of the Church. Beowulf, the first epic in the English language, has to be translated into modern English in order to be understood by most people. Gone too are the historical setting of the poem and the tradition of oral recitation before crowds of kinsmen and loyal retainers. The society described in Beowulf persisted with some variation throughout most of the Middle Ages. At the close of the 14th century, Geoffrey Chaucer was reciting poetry at the court of Richard II. In Beowulf, we hear the episode about Hæthcyn killing his brother Herobeald while hunting, and how their father died from grief. In 1100, William II, the second Norman ruler of England, was also killed by a stray arrow on a hunting expedition. The strong ties of allegiance between nobles and their kings, as depicted in the many asides to Germanic tribal histories, was the forerunner to the feudal system that dominated European life until the Renaissance and Reformation. And as all of these considerations were commonplace to the people of the first millennium, they are foreign to us today. Perhaps the most foreign concepts from the tribal days are the notion of weregild and the prevalence of bloody feuds. During these ages, which are dark at least in the lack of historical light that shines from, the value of each person was rated monetarily according to his status in society. Thus each man, weir, had his price, gild, which could be paid to his kinsman by the person who killed him, whether accidentally or intentionally. And the payment of a weregild was supposed to be accepted as the alternative to seeking vengeance against the slayer. The strict enforcement of this system created the dilemma which caused King Hraethul to sorrow himself to death when one son, Hæthcyn, accidentally slew the other, Herobeald. Along with the grief, still natural for any father losing a son tragically, we are told twice that Raethel was particularly vexed because there is no way to pay the weir-guilt or exact the revenge upon his own son. Even the attack on the hall by Grendel's mother is pictured as a justified retaliation within the context of this warrior culture. Furthermore, after her attack, Beowulf tells Hrothgar it is better to avenge the loss of one's friend than to spend too much time in mourning. And the fire dragon, too, had been bothering no one until his treasure hoard was robbed. Time after time, the simple narrative of Beowulf is interrupted with yet another episode in intertribal feuding, where vengeance is claimed for one killing only to ensure that the new victim's allies will retaliate with more bloodshed. Some scholars even claim that the history of the feuds is the main reason the poem was written. The preponderance of feuds and the concept of weregild do help explain one of the trouble spots in the understanding of Beowulf. How much influence does Christianity exert upon it? The pagan elements in Beowulf are unmistakable. One of the first passages in the poem describes Skjoldskjefing's Viking burial at sea as his ship is loaded with his treasures to send him to his afterlife. The funeral pyres of those slain at Finnsburg and that of Beowulf himself are signs of pre-Christian influences. And when in despair over Grendel's attacks, Hrothgar's subjects offer prayers to their war idols, the poet interjects that these people were ignorant of God and the proper ways of worship. Yet Hrothgar's shop has already sung a Christian hymn of creation, and Grendel has been identified as a descendant of Cain, the first murderer and the original outlaw. Also God, and not any of the Old Norse gods, is credited with assisting Beowulf in his triumphs. But there is no mention of saints or angels, church dogma or holy relics, or Christ and the cross. And the main reason for this has to be the warrior society's total sanctioning of blood feuds, a message directly opposed to the Christian golden rule and the idea of turning one's other cheek if affronted. All of the heroes would be condemned by their actions if the notion of Christian charity were ever invoked. And without the constant feuding, the story would not exist. In effect, the poet has created a pre-Christian society similar to the way many Christians see Judaism as a precursor to Christianity, which then fulfills it. This view, of course, is not accepted by Jews, nor do Christians accept a similar interpretation of their faith by Muslims. But in the days immediately following the conversion of the Germanic pagans, the literary treatment of the old legends by the Christian Beowulf poet provides a bridge for the new converts from their previous worldview to their new one. As incompatible with traditional Christianity as the notion of blood feuds is the Anglo-Saxon conception of weird, or fate. Weird ruled the Germanic pagan universe, subjecting gods and men alike to a random chance that could make their glory or doom their lives and memories without warning. Weird is not the will of God, because as Beowulf explains while telling the story of his swimming match with Breca, a man's courage can sometimes prevent fate from ending his life if his doom has not been determined. A man's courage was his only weapon against his impending doom, and it was up to that courage to make a man a hero and keep his name alive after his death. Thus, along with such attributes as being a good ruler and a good leader of his men, Beowulf is eulogized in the final lines of the poem as being most eager for fame. This eagerness for glory produces results in a boastfulness called flighting among the warriors that runs counter to modern ideas about noble conduct. When Unferth, criticizes Beowulf for losing a swimming match with Breca, Beowulf replies with the true story of what actually happened, including his fights with sea monsters. Beowulf then snidely tells Unferth that if he were as good a fighter as he is a talker, Beowulf wouldn't have had to come to Hrothgar's rescue. Just as the recitation of one's lineage establishes a certain amount of credibility among strangers, the flyting adds to their knowledge and gives them information for ranking the newcomer among those they know. Also, the boasting can also be seen as a way for the boaster to put himself into a proper frame of mind for the next heroic deed he will undertake. In a society based on glory, traits like modesty, understatement, or self-deprecating humor would hinder one's advancement. The warrior society described in Beowulf is one that is also not congenial with the idea of equality between men and women. Hrothgar's queen, Wealhtheow, and Higelac queen, Hugd, are accorded honor by other characters, and the poet too. But their presence is barely noted, and we never learn the name of Beowulf's wife, or if, indeed, he ever married. Wealhtheow is given a speech with tragic irony when she mistakenly praises Hrothulf as one who will protect her young sons, when he will in fact depose and slay Hraethik, the eldest, and assume the kingship himself. Her daughter, Freyawaru, will be given as a peace bride to Ingeld, the Heathobard's king, whose father was slain by the Danes. Beowulf correctly predicts to Higelac that the Heathobards will react with violence when the Danish nobles attend the wedding wearing armor and ornaments taken from the slain Heathobards. Earlier in the story of Finnsburg, we have seen how Hildeburh, who seems to have been another peace weaver, was treated to seeing her husband, brother, and son slain during a similar uprising of blood-feud revenge. A less passive and less praiseworthy lady was Modthruthu, who caused any man who dared to look upon her to be slain until she was given as a bride to the continental Offa. When Wealhtheow serves the mead cup to those assembled at Heorot, this illustrates that women are accorded positions of honorary importance, but they are definitely subservient to the men and pawns in the political games of the period. But women were not totally powerless. When Higelac dies in battle, Hugd has the authority to offer the kingship to Beowulf, whether for the good of the Geats, her own self-protection, or to protect her young son from his most powerful kinsman. Protect her young son from his most powerful kinsman. Beowulf, of course, declines the offer and pledges to support Heardred until the latter is old enough to rule on his own. This reinforces what we have already learned, that Beowulf's heroism comes from more than just physical strength. He does fight, and valiantly, when the Geats battle the Franks and Swedes. But we have no report of his attacking another tribe during his long reign. He gains his heroic stature not by fighting men like himself, but by fighting monsters and dragons, or in other words, by fighting evil itself. His courage and victories echo across more than 14 centuries, and thus far, the fame that Beowulf sought so eagerly still lives in the minds of the English-speaking peoples.